Isn't nature beautiful? So calm, so tranquil. No! So this leads us to today's poem, Exposure by Wilfred Owen. A poem seemingly about war, but actually it's about the power of nature. Wilfred Owen was born in 1893 and at the age of 22 joined the army so that he could go and fight in World War One. He wanted to fight for his country. He genuinely believed that he was defending it against the Germans, but sadly he died in 1918 at a very young age of 25 years old. Before we step into the poem, it's obviously important to get an idea of the context. We're talking World War One. You might be wondering, why did the First World War start? Well, for that, I'm going to pass you over to the guy that plays Mr. Bean.
You see, Baltic, in order to prevent war in Europe, two superblocks developed. Us, the French and the Russians on one side, and the Germans and Austro-Hungary on the other. The idea was to have two vast opposing armies, each acting as the other's deterrent. That way, there could never be a war.
But this is a sort of a war, isn't it, sir?
Yes, that's right. You see, there was a tiny flaw in the plan.
What was that, sir?
It was b****s.
Lol. At the start of World War One, joining the army was considered a good thing to do for young men. You got the chance to travel, you got the chance to hang out with your mates, you got a roof over your head, and you got a bit of adventure in your life. You might even get to see the world. Joining the army was a good life choice. Wilfred Owen would have seen posters advertising joining the army like this, suggesting that the war is something fun and exciting. Look at the casual way this soldier's inviting people to join. Come on boys, it'll be fun. What most of those men did not know was that the conditions in the trenches where they were more than likely going to be sent were appalling. And there wasn't really very much war going on for a lot of them. What Wilfred Owen found is that he spent most of his time sitting around doing nothing. Nothing was going on. He didn't have anybody to shoot at. He just had to sit there in the trenches and wait for bombs to drop or wait for a whistle to go so he'd run over the top and probably die that way. It was not fun. The clothing wasn't adequate. People at the time thought the war would be over very quickly. They had no idea how long it would go on. Winter set in into the flooded trenches and men would suffer from trench foot, a form of disgusting fungus that would eat away at the flesh on your feet. Men were dying from the cold rather than from bullets. Wilfred Owen found himself sitting in trenches and looking around at his comrades as they slowly suffered, not because of the war, but because of nature itself. And thus, this inspired him to write his poem Exposure. So let's take a quick look at the story behind the poem. Fairly straightforward. Nothing happens. Nothing happens. Nothing happens. Nothing happens. And nothing happens. By nothing happening, he means there's no war going on. There's no opportunity to actually do something. It's basically sitting around. They are sitting in appalling weather conditions, merciless winds. They've got rain soaking everything. You've got snow to contend with. It's so cold that the mud is freezing and you have to use pickaxes and shovels to try and bury your dead. It's almost as if the bigger enemy here is not the Germans, but nature itself. And that's pretty much it for the story. Nothing happens, except appalling suffering. And that suffering isn't even caused by the war itself. The suffering is caused by the power of nature. And that power is shown to be more deadly than some of the bullets flying about over him. Okay, let's look at the language. First of all, we begin. The poet says our brains ache. Verb, it suggests pain straight away. What that suffering is up to debate. Is it a psychological brain ache, something worrying them, the stress of war perhaps? Or is it a physical ache, like a headache, caused by the merciless iced east winds? Again, a sense of suffering, facing an enemy that is described using an adjective as without mercy. Mercy here meaning a sense of kindness or fairness in war. So within the first line we immediately have the narrator's sense of suffering and an immediate mention that the culprit for this suffering is none other than the wind, nature herself. And we discover that nature is an unkind, unfair power Wilfred Owen's used a verb here. He's turned the noun knife into a verb to cut, literally slicing the soldiers. The stanza finishes with a description of their feelings and the area around them. And I think the most important language device here is alliteration of the sound S. When you have alliteration with the sound S, it's usually called sibilance. So if you want to show off to the examiner, use sibilance. You've got silent dropping flares, confused our memories of the salient, worried by silence, sentries, whisper, curious, nervous, but nothing happens. This use of the S sound here, the sound of the S is quite harsh, again suggesting the harshness of the place they're in. The harsh S sound perhaps gives us the impression of those merciless ice east winds. And finally, in this first stanza, you have the first line, which is repeated throughout the poem. So this is your first example of repetition throughout the poem, but nothing happens. Again, the use of repetition here is to emphasize the fact that literally nothing is going on. The only thing that is doing anything is nature, and what nature is doing, whilst they do nothing, is to kill them. Let's tidy up a little bit. In the second stanza, we've got again another interesting adjective describing the wind. The wind is coming in mad gusts. Mad, this adjective suggests that nature is without reason, without thought, totally chaotic. You're never going to be able to convince it to do something because it is crazy. We also have some more imagery here, like twitching agonies of men, a great simile, again suggesting the enormous suffering these soldiers are having to deal with against the power of nature. And this stanza finishes with what can only be described as a dangerous comment for a soldier: to question the orders that have been given to him. That particular theme of following orders or not links very well with Charge of the Light Brigade. See the video I've made on that. Third stanza, all the soldiers can think about is war, rain and clouds. Simply those things. And again, the soldiers are described as shivering ranks of grey. A metaphor, the word in that metaphor, shivering, obviously again suggesting more suffering. And the inclusion of colour, grey, links to this constant repetition of nothing happening. There's no colour in the world, there's no variety. It's grey, like a black and white TV. In the fourth stanza, you've got some more sibilance. This time, the sibilance of perhaps the sound of the bullets as they streak. Sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence. Again, the S sound is still sounding pretty harsh here. So perhaps the sound of the bullets and the sound of the wind are equally as dangerous. However, the poet confirms for us that the bullets are less deadly than the air being so very, very cold. The fourth stanza finishes again with that repetition of "but nothing happens." The fifth stanza, the extreme cold, it makes them cringe in holes. Cringe is a verb, and it suggests the men were like small animals that have to curl themselves up to protect themselves from something bigger. A boxer doesn't cringe. A mouse can cringe, though. We have a bit of, I can only think of some sort of delirium, some sort of dreamlike state that's perhaps brought on by the extreme cold. There are different interpretations of this bit, but I think for our purposes it's easy enough to suggest that it's a dreamlike state. You start seeing ghosts and dark red jewels and innocent mice and so on. It all gets a bit odd, but not really surprising considering how cold it is. We then find ourselves in a very sad and depressing part of the poem. We're talking about the loss of the sun, the loss of children, the loss of fields, the loss of fruit, even they're losing their love of God. And like questioning one's orders, this was also a very shocking thing to say at the time. And the poem ends with that repetition, but nothing happens. On a side note, it is worth remembering that the very person that wrote this poem did eventually die in these very trenches he's describing to us. And it's only by fortune that somebody had the good sense to pick up his notes and ultimately publish his poems. Okay, let's take a look at the structure. The structure in this poem is a really good one to talk about because it has a very memorable feature. One of the first things I normally point out is whether it's in the first person or second person or third person. This is in the first person, but uniquely it is in the first person plural. That means the narrator here is not one person, not one individual. The narrator here is a collective of men. Our, we are doing this, we are doing that. And I think that makes it very interesting. The poet recognizes that the suffering in war is not an individual experience, it's something experienced collectively. All his men, all his friends together. I think his suffering is linked to the suffering of his friends as well. Secondly, there's no rhyming and there's no particular rhythm. So it seems unstructured, but it's presented in these 8 stanzas, each of 4 lines in length. And to me this suggests 2 things. The unstructured rhyming and rhythm is nature. It's constant and it's chaotic. It's unpredictable. But the experience of these men is structured. It goes on and on and on and on. And when I say it goes on and on, nothing goes on and on and on. The poem doesn't really seem to have a beginning or an end. You know what you could do? You could start the poem at this stanza if you wanted. You could start the poem at this stanza if you wanted. I don't really think it would matter too much. And so that's the third comment about structure. There's no real beginning or end to this poem. For good reason, because nothing happens and just keeps not happening. And that too is part of the suffering. So what was the author's intention? We've covered the story, the language and the structure, so what was he trying to achieve? And it's here that we perhaps come to the most interesting of all intentions for all of the poems, simply because there's nothing to suggest that Wilfred Owen was planning to publish these poems. It's quite likely, and in every likelihood, he was writing these poems simply for himself. So in many ways you can say there is no intention by the poet to make any effect on any reader because the poet didn't intend it to be read. So in this case, perhaps the author doesn't have the intention, but the poem does have an intention. The poem does have an effect on its reader, and it seems to have a very purposeful effect. It wants to tell us 2 things. It wants to tell us about the suffering of the men, the weak men, the powerless men who were stuck in the trenches because they were ordered to, and this seems thoroughly unfair and miserable. And the second thing the poet is telling his audience, that the real power during this war is not the Germans nor the Allies. The greatest power of all is nature. And in a sense, that kind of makes all human power seem just a little bit silly, ridiculous, pointless. And those 2 intentions tie in with all the other poems that Wilfred Owen wrote. Wilfred Owen was definitely anti-war. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation. I hope it helps with the revision. Keep revising, not too long now.